Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start of course with the Bakhmut. As you can see, according to the Russian sources map, there are not much changes and there are no icons at all above Bakhmut. And this is the consequences of the decisions that the Russians took during the previous week. And we discussed this decision yesterday. As I told you, the Russians took a decision to make a small operational pause in Bakhmut. To tell the truth, I don't know the reasons why the Russians took such a decision. Maybe they don't have resources to continue offensive operation of Bakhmut. Maybe they're expecting of counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side. Maybe they're planning to start. The final rush on Monday within a day or something like this. It's very difficult to understand. But the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported and confirmed that during the previous 24 hours, when talking about the entire Donbas front line, and it is not just Bakhmut, the Ukrainians unfortunately lost just 80 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 4 artillery systems. So in comparison with the numbers from the previous days, we see that the level of losses is significantly low. And the same story about Liman, and we remember that Liman used to be something like support operation of Bakhmut operation, and the Russians are saying that Ukrainians lost unfortunately 90 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems. So as you can see, the level of losses is very low on Liman front line and on Bakhmut front line as well. Furthermore, we don't see any icons above this area, but it doesn't mean that there are no changes, that there are no activity, that everybody is doing nothing. No, there are a lot of things that are happening there every second, every minute, but they're not so important. Some sources are saying that today the Russians were trying to encircle Ukrainian forces who located on the south part of Bakhmut in the blocks like Budyonovka and Sobochayevka. As you know, this map is not updated. Most of the map shows that this south area is under Russian control, and during the previous 24 hours we received a lot of updates that the Russians were storming and pushing the Ukrainians in the direction of the stadium, and the same movements we could see from the Bakhmut river in the same direction. So the Russians were trying to encircle the Ukrainians in this area, and some sources are saying that Ukrainians have already appeared in some kind of artillery salient and they are no longer able to evacuate from this area. Furthermore, they need some kind of unblock operation. So imagine yourself that Ukrainian forces who located in the south of Bakhmut need some kind of unblock operation from the forces in the central part. In Bakhmut, that needs a global unblock operation from the forces outside. Situation is critical for the Ukrainians. The losses maybe today is not so high, but believe me, they're going to be grow more and more. And that's it about Bakhmut. And to tell the truth, today this is not the most important part of the front line. Today we have 2 other front lines that may be more important than Bakhmut, at least for today. And I'm talking about Avdiivka and I'm talking about Zaporozhye area. First, we're going to discuss Zaporozhye, and then we will turn to Avdiivka, because Avdiivka is one of the most important part of the front line. Now let's talk about Zaporozhye. As you know, in my previous video I reported that somewhere at noontime the Ukrainians started their small recon in combat in direction, let's say, of Tokmak. To be more precise, they were trying to investigate the Russians' defense position in this area, trying to analyze the speed of their reaction, trying to analyze which forces is connected between each other, which forces, let's say, answered first to this situation, who reacted first from the Russian side, and so on. And today the Ukrainians sent at least few armored fists in direction of, let's say, Rabotine, this small town that located on the south from Orekhov and Novodanilovka, from 2 directions. The first one from the west side of Novodanilovka in this direction. The second attack was on the east side from Novodanilovka in the same direction. All those attacks were repulsed. The Ukrainian lost a lot of armored vehicles. If we're talking just a local recon in combat, the Russians have already published video and photo of those lost armored vehicles. Few UPR 765, it's like Western weapon. I believe it's some kind of Australian or something like this. I don't remember exactly, or Dutch weapon. I don't remember. So this is the pictures of that attempt that were repulsed by the Russians. As a result, the Ukrainians, I believe they received some interesting piece of information. They understand the parts that from the Russian side who took place in that defense. They understand the forces that reacted to this operation. They managed to discover and spot the Russian artillery position. Believe me, this is not the final attack from the Ukrainian side. The intensivity and the number of these attacks will be increased from day to day. The same situation as we used to see in Kherson area during the counter-offensive operation in Kherson area. And the most important part, the most important thing that the Ukrainians managed to achieve, of course, they were defeated. They received just the losses, but there is only one benefit they received is information. And furthermore, they managed to teach forces to get them closer to each other and something like this. The Russians were saying that during that operation, the Ukrainians used their 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. This brigade is located in this area, 128th. Furthermore, the Ukrainians used some companies from 129th Territorial Defense Brigade, and also 106th Brigade took place in this operation. So 106, according to this map, this brigade is located here, but I believe that they were redeployed in this area to reinforce the forces in this area. So for now, there are no troubles for the Russians, and the Ukrainians couldn't deal a lot of damage to the Russians. But one more time, the Ukrainians will increase the intensivity and the number of such attacks. If we take a look at the Western sources map, of course, we understand that at least for now, at least at this stage of the year, at least this time of year, the Ukrainians can't go very far from the roads, and they can do small local attacks, and they need to stick to the roads. So first of all, and we understand that the main goal that Ukrainians want to achieve is to establish control over Tokmak, but they can go and move along the road if they're planning to attack during the April. Maybe in May they will be able to stretch their attack line and to use broad front line attacks and using fields and so on, but for now they need to stick to the roads. And if they want to attack in direction of Tokmak, the most important they need to do is to secure the flanks. And the most powerful flank where the Russian forces are located is Pologi. This very fortified position. And of course, the Ukrainians need to secure their forces that are going to move in direction of Tokmak from the flank attack from Pologi. For these purposes, of course, the Ukrainians need to return control over Nova Pokrovka, this one, because this town, if the Ukrainians are able to return control over this town, let's say to establish this line, they will be able to return control over this road, over this cross, over this intersection, and they will have more roads for movements of their armored vehicles during the spring campaign or something like this. I don't think that we need to discuss the further plans because it's very difficult to understand the real plans of the Ukrainians. It's small local plans that we have just discussed, and the main goal of those plans is to improve their local bridgehead in this area, to increase the bridgehead, to develop this bridgehead, to return control over some roads, over some fields, over some hills. Nothing important and nothing more than that we discussed right now. Furthermore, I can't even tell you that this is going to be their main direction. Maybe using their forces, using all these offensive operations and that we saw today and on the 15th of March, the Ukrainians are just trying to get as much as possible information. Furthermore, if you remember, when talking about Kherson, the Ukrainians used the same tactic. They were attacking the Russians in the vicinity of this area. There were a lot of clashes. Andreev, Kolazov, Davidbrody, all these towns. If you remember, the Ukrainians managed to develop some bridgehead around this area, but that area wasn't the main Ukrainian attack, main direction. They were attacking from the north in direction of Visokopol, Arkhangelsk, and they were pushing from this side. And when the Russians took a decision to step back, they just managed to cross this area and to take entire Kherson. So the attacks in direction from Orekhov in direction of Tokmak is just the same thing. I believe that the Ukrainians are going to establish control over some bridgehead to force the Russians to change their focus on this area, and after that they will be able to attack somewhere else, somewhere where they think and they understand that the Russians have the lowest positions or the weakest positions or something like this. the farthest position from the logistic roads or something like this. So this is about Orekhov. And now let's talk about Avdiivka. Today we received a lot of updates from this area. For now this map is not updated, but as you can see, let's return back also to the Russian sources map, because as you can see there are a lot of updates according to the Russian sources map, and there are a lot of icons above the territory, above the small town Krasnogorovka. The Russians reported that they established final control, or 100% control over the road that connects this small village Veselaya, this one Veselaya village on the Western sources map. The Russians established control over entire Krasnogorovka. They got control over this hill that's located on the west of Krasnogorovka. For these purposes, let's take a look at the Institute of Study of War map. Here we can find this hill. So this Avdiivka, and the Russians got control over this 267 meters hill. As you can see, this is a very top position, and from this area the Russians are able to control everything in the vicinity of this town. And the most important, they can control the towns like Stepovo and Berdichi that located on the west side from the railroad and the west side from Krasnogorovka. The Russians still haven't established control over Kamyanka, but there are very heavy clashes, and as you can see the Western source map shows the icon of AK-47 that the Russians are trying to do this. Furthermore, the Russians, so as you can see, the Russians established a very powerful bridgehead on the north of Avdiivka. Now we will discuss more updates that we received for today about Avdiivka, but before we start, I would like to tell you that this is not just an operational encirclement or maybe tactical encirclement. The situation in Avdiivka is much worse than the situation in Bakhmut. For now, nobody talks about this. We haven't received updates. Avdiivka is not so important maybe for Western media, but from point of view, if compare Avdiivka and Bakhmut as a fortress, a strategical ground or something like this, Avdiivka is 10 times more important than Bakhmut, maybe 1,000 times more important than Bakhmut, and the situation around Avdiivka is maybe 10 times worse than the situation in Bakhmut. Why is that? First of all, if we take a look at Bakhmut, Chasov Yar is very close. The Ukrainians have possibilities to keep their artillery in the residential area. They still have possibility to support. There's a very short distance between these two towns. They have possibility to do rotation during the night process. And the most important, nobody knows, one more time, whether there are some kind of underground tunnels under Bakhmut and Chasov Yar. We discussed that many times, that there are a lot of underground facilities under Paraskoviivka, under Solidar, and so on, but nobody discussed ever about any underground tunnels above Bakhmut. And if you know the experience in Syria, almost every single town had another town underground. For now, I don't think that there are some kind of this, but I'm just trying to give you some examples that nothing is so bad around Bakhmut. Yes, there's some kind of operational encirclement, but anyway, as we see, the Ukrainians still have possibilities to hold this town. Now let's return back to Avdiivka. And the progress on the north of Avdiivka is very critical and dangerous for the Ukrainians. Let's return back to the Western sources map and let's update this area. According to the Russian information, they have established control the previous week over a town by the name of Veselaya, and they reached the outskirts, or maybe this dam itself, and now there are very heavy clashes around Kamyanka, and I believe that this town is going to be taken as well. So we know that the Russians are pushing from the south, and let's also update this map according to information we have, because Vadiana, according to the Russian sources, is under Russian control. So these two blue clouds is the territories that are under Russian control. And from this perspective, we see that for now there are nothing terrible for the Ukrainians, but it is not like that. Now let's continue. If we try to split Avdiivka for many parts, we're going to see that there are at least three blocks of Avdiivka that is very powerful and well fortified. The first one is the north, because it's industrial zone, and we know that if it's industrial zone, that it is automatically something like a small fortress. The second one is the residential area, this one on the west south of Avdiivka, and we discussed this area many times. This is the residential area with the very big buildings. It's like something like Ugledar, but if we try to calculate and to analyze the these squares, these small uglidars, like there are like 2 or 3 uglidars in this area in comparison with original uglidar. So imagine yourself the fortification level of this territory. And the third powerful fortified area, well fortified area, is the south of Avdiivka, this one. And the reason is that this area is under Ukrainian control since the beginning of this conflict in the territory of Ukraine. And there are trenches. I believe that these trenches start somewhere here around the road and they end somewhere here in the middle part of Avdiivka. So this well fortified area, and Ukrainians invest a lot of resources to prepare this area before possible Russian attack. So these are three most powerful fortified area in Avdiivka. And as you can see, if we take a look at this map, you're gonna see that there are some blocks that are not so well fortified as these 3 blocks. And I'm talking about this central part of Avdiivka, this one. I will do this, I will color this area. Let's color this in yellow for better performance of this situation. So this area is not so fortified, and of course I believe that this area is not so well fortified as well. And I think that Ukrainians don't have possibilities to make some, I don't know, powerful fortification actions or fortification events to reinforce this area, to increase the level of defense of this area, because they don't have such possibilities. We understand that if the Russians controls this small salient in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka, we know for sure that the railroad has been already cut from the Avdiivka, and that means that they are no longer able to move some necessary parts to prepare fortifications in this area. And this is the main reason why the Russians are so active from the north. And I believe that we discussed during my previous videos that the Russians will try to encircle Avdiivka to create a cauldron, that they're going to move from, let's say, Vadiana front line in direction of Berdichi, trying to meet with the Russian forces somewhere in Berdichi from the south and from the Krasnogorovka. But now I understand that something tells me that we are not going to see such type of operation. I think that the Russians will try to move from the north in direction exactly of these 2 residential areas. This is very nice positions, very nice movements. Let's take a look at this map. We see that this is complete residential areas, and if we compare every single part of block of Avdiivka, we understand that I'm not saying that it's going to be a very easy job. No, it's not an easy job at all to storm this fortress, but in comparison with the other blocks, it's the easiest way to establish control over entire Avdiivka. Now, you might ask me, why do I think the Russians are not going to move from Vadiana to the north, trying to create the real cauldron, real encirclement? And the problem is, of course, artillery. Artillery is the main problem for the Russians to complete encirclement operation of Avdiivka. When we were talking about Bakhmut, the main problem to encircle Bakhmut was the very close disposition of Chasov Yar and Canal. So the Russians can't take control over Ivanovska and Bogdanovka because these 2 towns are located very close to another fortress, and the Ukrainians don't have any problems to move their reserves in these towns. Furthermore, these towns are connected with, let's say, main base in Chasov Yar through forests. So that means that the Ukrainians are able to move forces even that can be hidden from the Russians' let's say, satellites, drones, and so on. And this is the reason why it's so difficult to encircle Bakhmut, and of course the number of forces, of course. But from geographical perspective, we can say that this is one of the most important factors that force the Russians to take a small operational pause in this area, and why the Russians still haven't established 100% over Bakhmut. Now let's return to Avdiivka and let's try to analyze why the Russians they are no longer able or not able to attack from the south in direction of Berdichi. And the main reason is that the Ukrainians, as I told you, artillery is the main factor. And as we understand, the Ukrainians have their artillery positions somewhere here, and from these positions the Ukrainians are able to attack the Russians if they start their movement to the north. So we can say that let's say that the perfect situation for the Russians when they are able to establish, let's say, cauldron is something like this. So if the Russians are able to develop their bridgehead like this, as the like top cloud. This one, let's color this cloud in green for better performance and understanding. So if the Russians are able to establish control over this green cloud, we can say about the 100% encirclement and cauldron in Avdiivka. And why the Russians can't do this? One more time, the Ukrainians can establish their artillery system here on the, let's say, the west bank of these water reservoirs. And to tell the truth, the Russians don't have possibilities to suppress this artillery with their own artillery. The only possible solution for the Russians is to use drones. But anyway, they need to send drones very far from the mainland. And of course, the Ukrainians can shut these drones down, or they can, let's say, hide their own weapon, and you need to to find this weapon. For these purposes, you need to send another drones that can try to find and discover the Ukrainian artillery positions. And so let's say the Russians started their movement from the south in direction of Toninka and Severnaya. They're trying to storm this area and so on. And from this perspective, the Ukrainians can attack the Russians using their artillery system, and they can cover this entire area heavily with artillery fire. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are able to use like local small mortars to attack the same area, let's say from the east. And of course, the Ukrainians do have possibilities to cover this area with artillery from the north. So as you can see, this is small salient, artillery trap that the Russians can appear in if they start movements to the north. Of course, we understand that the Russians can start something like counter-artillery duels to support the forces who goes from the south. But for these purposes, if the Russians want to attack the Ukrainian forces somewhere here, they need to deploy their forces, artillery system somewhere in Peski. Let's say if they want to support the Ukrainians, let's say from the western flank, they need to deploy their forces in Peski and to attack the Ukrainians, and the distance is around 20 kilometers, and in comparison with the Ukrainians, the distance is just 12 kilometers. So also it's completely different picture. But anyway, let's assume that the Russians are able to deploy their forces, artillery forces in Peski, and they start artillery duels with the Ukrainians that are located on this bank of water reservoirs. As you can see, even from this perspective, they can't cover the entire area on the western side of this water reservoir. And this is not even the most important. The Russians have a lot of accurate artillery systems that they can use to suppress the Ukrainian artillery systems. The most important problem in this case is the Ukrainian forces that located in Nivoyska. That was the real plan why the Russians were trying to push the Ukrainians from Nivoyska, and because the Ukrainians were using and still uses Nivoyska as the main bridgehead for their own artillery systems, for mortars and so on. And if the Russians deploy their forces in Peski, the Ukrainians are able to attack these forces from Nivoyska with their own artillery systems. And as you can see, the Ukrainians will have a lot of possibilities, a lot of chances to be much more successful than the Russians. And the same situation from Krasnogorovka. They still can have possibilities to suppress the Russians from Krasnogorovka using their own artillery systems. And this is the reason why the Russians can attack from the north, from Vysyola. First of all, the thing is that the Russians have already secured their back flank, this one, and from this perspective, the Russians are able to suppress any artillery that the Ukrainians are going to use. The Ukrainians attacks the Russians in their back, and the Russians from these positions are able to suppress any type of Ukrainian artillery. So this is the reason why this is the most secured way to attack, is because protection and support from Russian artillery. And the second reason is that they will attack the Ukrainian positions in the back that are less fortified than positions in the industrial zone, in this residential area, and on the south of Ukraine. I believe that the Russians will try to develop this bridgehead. They will try to make some pushes, but it will be something like fake operation just with one purpose: to force the Ukrainians to change their focus and not to allow the Russians to develop a lot. This is the situation about Avdiivka. Furthermore, some Russian sources are saying that after the Russians established control over Krasnogorovka and Veselova, they continued their offensive operation in the direction of Stepovoy and Berdichi, and some sources are saying that this evening there were a piece of news that there are clashes inside of Berdichi from the north side of Avdiivka. There are still no any video or any photo confirmation of that, and we received that update just from the few sources. But today, let's say that was the first confirmation or first update about some operation from the north. And if this is not a speculation, and if this is true, this is the complete encirclement of Avdiivka, and this is going to be a very big disaster for the Ukrainians. And this is the reason why I told you during this video that maybe Bakhmut wasn't even a real operation, and the main thing that the Russians were trying to achieve during the Bakhmut operation is to force the Ukrainians to move as much as possible reserves to this area, and the Russians understood that the Ukrainians need to keep forces in Zaporozhye because the Western countries in the NATO are forcing the Ukrainians to start greatest offensive operation in this area, and the Ukrainian military authorities, they didn't have even an option to move some reserves from this area because they were under complete control of the NATO forces. And the only possible area that Ukrainians could use where they could get reserves is Avdiivka. And of course they did that. That forced the Ukrainians to reduce the defense possibilities of this area. And now the Russians started their greatest unblocking, or greatest offensive operation in this area, trying to push the Ukrainians as far as possible from this area. Furthermore, don't forget, as we discussed many videos ago, Donetsk is the perfect place where the Russians are able to hide endless number of forces, armored vehicles, anything they need, and they can use these forces at some certain time, and the Ukrainians won't even understand what happened. So let's discuss just the losses from the Ministry of Defense. About the reports, the Russians are saying that when talking about Kherson area, the Ukrainians unfortunately lost 20 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. And when talking about Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. So it's a very big losses among people. So, but as I always tell you, Military Summer channel condemns any violence in Ukraine. And that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.